Okay, great. So, yeah, the 1920s is, I think everybody already knows, a really fascinating decade in the history of our country. And it's a topic that I think is perennially interesting because there's so many things that happened in the 1920s that we can connect to today. And that is one of the themes I'm going to be developing. I did all of my schooling, college and graduate school in the South, but I'm originally from Michigan. And I mention that because I love cars. And I'm actually going to be talking about cars a lot. It's been the first half of this presentation because the automobile is a defining phenomenon of the experience of the 1920s. And the importance of this new technology, or relatively new technology, and the doors that it was opening up, both for people's experience but also for the economy, is really important to stress. Today we talk a lot about cars too. We talk about electric vehicles. This is something that is in the news every day. And my intention is not to say that the 1920s is like today, but I do think by going through this presentation, if we think of it as a little bit of a mirror that is held up, we're going to see that a lot of the things that we're talking about as a society today, about change, about tradition, about progressivism, about conservatism, you're going to see that these struggles were definitely happening in the 1920s. We have a phrase these days that gets used called culture wars. I'm pretty sure that phrase was first used in the 1990s, but you're going to see very much a time of culture war happening as we go through this presentation as well. It probably can be guessed at by the contrast between the two images that I have here, the Ku Klux Klan marching down Pennsylvania on one hand, and then this is an actress, Louise Brooks. And we'll be unpacking both of these images a little later on, and we'll certainly do questions and answers, and well, we'll see what the answers are, but we'll do some questions at the end as well. So, to contextualize everything we're going to talk about in the 1920s, it's important to think big about not just what's happening in the United States at that time, but how the United States was postured in the world. We're coming out of World War I as we go into the decade of the 1920s, and that's really important for the economic part of this story. Which we'll see unfolding. So Europe was in many ways destroyed in World War I. Not the same level of cities being leveled by carpet bombing like happened in World War II, but there was enormous loss of life and enormous loss of economic capability. There were 37 million casualties in World War I. And so there were many, many people in the workforce in Europe who were no longer alive, or if they were alive, unable to return to their jobs in productivity. A lot of the cropland, especially if we think about the Western Front, a lot of the cropland was destroyed. And so the United States had a relatively low loss of life in World War I. And of course, none of the battles were fought here on this soil. And so as Europeans were coming to terms with the destruction that they experienced, this is you can see the caption there, this is a British painter, Paul Nash. And this is, for me, one of the most representative pieces of art at the end of the war, trying to come to terms with just how much destruction had been experienced. There are some interesting elements in this painting that you might find interesting. I personally interpret some of these burned out trees, especially this one here, to be sort of representative of a hand. Just as some of these little hillocks made from the shelling might be thought of as either soldier helmets or grave markers. And I think there's some symbolism in here that the artist was trying to get at just how destructive the war had been. But here in the United States, you've got factories like the River Rouge plant outside of Detroit that are humming, and once the boys come home, they walk right back into the factory and be productive. So the economic production is a really important backdrop to everything that's happening in the 1920s. United States exports were booming. what is this, a 400% increase in just a 2-year time period. In the exports, the United States was sending out to European allies. The gross national product had grown about 40% from 1922 to 1929. So this wasn't just growth during the war. This was sustained growth that carried out for the next decade after the war. And you can see some of the figures here about the increase of output and worker productivity. Everybody's somewhat familiar with the idea of Ford's assembly line, and many companies were using these techniques. There was a business engineer named Frederick Taylor, who developed something known as scientific management. And it leads to things like the assembly line. It's how you can get more, the same amount of people to do more work, to be more productive. Factory production was a big part of this. And so many people were dependent on the automobile industry for their jobs. If you add up the workers who made the steel, who provided the oil, petroleum, who did the glass, who did the rubber, there's about 3.7 million Americans whose jobs were directly linked to the production of Ford's automobiles. So the ripple effect out into the economy. And if you look at the Great Lakes region, it's really interesting to see like the steel mills in Pittsburgh and Cleveland, the oil fields in eastern Ohio. Toledo, Ohio was Glass City. In fact, they used to play a football game there called the Glass Bowl. And then the rubber industry in places like Akron and Youngstown, Firestone, Goodyear. So many people were tied into the production of automobiles. And so this is the backbone of the economy. They also were learning a lot about advertising at this time period. This is a time where we see a proliferation of print advertising. And I include this one. This is the Ford Model B. It came out after the Model T. And I love this advert because you can read the text and it's got some interesting elements to it. Things people like today in car shopping and other consumerism, like being able to choose the colors that you want and customize the vehicle. I think that's important when everybody's buying something that's being mass produced on an assembly line. It's pretty impersonal, but they figured out that if you added some individual choice into this could stimulate consumers. And I love this image, and especially since we're here in southern New England, I think this is very typical scenery from this part of the country. And you notice how they not only are showing you that this is part of a good life, right? It's a pretty magnificent home here, but you've got the hibiscus and maybe that's where Jim the hummingbird would come and to take a visit. I also am waiting for them. I've got to put my feeders out this week. The Orioles too, I hope. So it's showing this kind of the good life, but one of the things that's really fascinating in this ad is how it's showing change. We've got the horse and the buggy, and it's giving you a sense of everything that goes into that. And yet here's this bright, shiny car in the foreground. And it's really a message of, you can put away the old ways because now we have this new way. And as I go through all of this, the contrast between old and new is going to be an important theme when we think about the 1920s. So advertising is going to come back here in a few minutes as we go forward. But this is before we get into any of the cultural or political struggles and battles that happened. I think it's really important to understand that there's this economic boom happening that's going to be driving a lot of this. This industrialism was having ripple effects in other aspects of the society, and it was really driving people into cities. There is common throughout history a phrase, from farm to factory. And you see it in any country that industrializes. People leave the countryside and they go into the cities. Like in mainland China today, when they do the Lunar Festival, the Lunar New Year, the transportation industry is so strained as people are leaving from the megacities and trying to go back to the villages and smaller towns from which they have come, and sometimes just really recently in the last few decades. Here in New England, we're pretty familiar with Lowell and Lawrence and the idea of the Lowell girls, the young women who left their farms and went to these new growing cities and lived in dormitories and worked in the factories and in fact had a lot of educational and social and other civic opportunities by doing that. Well, lots of people were moving to cities. There were many, many Southerners, particularly African Americans from the South, who were trying to take advantage of this industrial boom. Many of the companies had refused to hire black workers, but during World War I, there was a worker shortage. You've probably heard of the Lusitania, right? The cruise liner that was torpedoed by the German Navy out in the North Atlantic. It wasn't easy to cross the ocean during the war. So many of those, especially men, who would have been coming over here for work were being conscripted into the armies of Europe. They couldn't leave. They were going into military camps and being employed in the war. So with that labor shortage, a lot of northern manufacturers, and Henry Ford included, began to hire African Americans. And so you can disregard these green arrows here. These represent a migration that happened during World War II when the country was fighting the war in the Pacific. But these darker green arrows from the deep south here to not only New England, but across the northern tier and into the Great Lakes industrial regions. I love this painting by Jacob Lawrence, who did a series of about 60 panels that depicted this migration of black Southerners to the north. It wasn't just black Southerners, a lot of Southerners of European descent also coming to the north during this time as these factories were just really, really expanding. So this movement of people, mass movement of people, there were about 3.5 million black Southerners who left from the South between 1910 and 1940. So one of the other things is people are moving around in cars, but they're also moving in a lot of other ways and finding new lives. Again, an element of change that was happening. And cities were growing. It's not just people moving around domestically in the country. Other than that period during the war, there was massive immigration into the United States. From 1870 to 1920, about 30.5 million people moved into the United States. At that time, the census of 1920 only counted about 100 million Americans. So in the previous decades, you'd had 30 million people come in, and there's only 100 million. So that's something like 1 out of 3 people in the country either were foreign-born or likely their parents were born in another country. So this is going to have a lot of impact on the makeup of the society with all this injection of new and different people. We'll get to that a little further as well, but when we think about the people who were coming into, and what an idealized image, right, of immigration, come to America, it's a shining golden city, and this rainbow of American flag colors, and you've got this woman who's maybe a little reticent, a little hesitant. Of course, these folks, most of them were never going to see their homes again. I just rewatched one of my favorites. I'm not really into musicals, but I love Fiddler on the Roof. And the end of the story when they're leaving Anatevka and they're like, where are you going to go? And oh, I'm New York, or my cousin is Chicago, right? And these people were never going to see their homes again. But there were also those who were more hopeful and helpful and thinking this is where we're going to make our new start. So crowding into the cities, particularly here on the East Coast. Out west, there was a lot of immigration from East Asia, a lot of Chinese and Japanese immigrants, especially after the gold rush in California in the 1840s. So there's massive numbers of people coming into the United States. Here in New England, we're very familiar with the migration from Eastern Canada. French Canadians leaving from Quebec and New Brunswick and Nova Scotia and coming here to the mill cities in New England and bringing new culture and new people. And a lot of the folks, of course, were coming with very, very little. And so they ended up crowded into neighborhoods such as Little Italy in New York. We could show North End in Boston. We could show Southie in Boston. It's all the ethnic enclaves that people arrived into. So cities are growing as a result of industry. people moving internally, people coming from other countries. And with this, it's really bringing together a lot of people who previously were not together. People who lived far away from each other with different languages, particularly with the Southern and Eastern European immigrants. This was a country that was majority Protestant Christian. Many of these immigrants were not Protestants. In fact, they were Catholics or East Orthodox or Jews. So they're bringing a lot of that diversity as well with them, in addition to language and foodways and so many other factors. So this is, again, that theme of change. There's also another factor that I find really fascinating that's also driving urbanization and the growth of cities is the end of the frontier. The census of 1890 was the first one that revealed, for the first time in American history, you couldn't draw a line north to south and say on the east side is where you have the American civilization, the United States, and on the west side you have the Native Americans. In the 1890 census, all those wars that had been fought out west, the Battle of Little Bighorn and the Sioux Wars, had really broken down and ended the frontier. Native Americans were being put onto reservations rather than having the free roam of the land. And so people were worried about that. There's one of the most famous American historians, Frederick Jackson Turner, was a professor out at University of Wisconsin, wrote an essay in response to this census data that showed that there no longer was a frontier. And he said, what are Americans going to do? There's always been a frontier. Go west, young man, right? And start over and find your future. And what would Americans do if they couldn't spread out anymore? Well, one of the things they started to do was instead of building out, they started to build up. And people went into the cities to find their opportunities. And we see this very much in a city like Boston today, right? Young people say, hey, you're going to start your life, get a leg up in the world. They're not going out to the prairie. They go to a university in Boston and try to get a job and work for a company or something like this. So the cities became the place. And by 1920, the census showed that Americans, by and large, were living in urban areas rather than the rural. So this is another change. A country that was basically a farming country, by and large, was becoming an urban and factory-based society. Very different. So a little bit of historical theory. And if anybody wants to know more, I brought the book. We can pass it around later. This is called The New American History. And it's not that new anymore. This was published in 1997 from a historical perspective. That's still pretty new, I'd say. But Thomas Bender, really influential American historian, writes an essay in here about intellectual and cultural history. And he, like many historians, have found a connection between city building, economic growth, and social change. This is something that we see. We're not like sociologists looking for like patterns and theories all the time. Historians tend to be pretty just fact-based. But we have seen patterns where there's urbanization, economic growth, social change tends to unleash lots of other forces of change and newness. And so a quote from his essay that these types of changes lead people to break old forms, construct new identities, liberate new desires, even by implication create new politics. And so all of this change and all of this newness that we can say is going to cause a conflict between the older traditional American values, especially rooted in rural life, with these new dynamics that are happening in fast-paced cities, with lots of different people coming together, and that is going to create sparks of cultural conflict, and also political conflict, and in some cases, violent conflict as well in this decade of the 20s. So if we go back to this idea, okay, we're looking to break old forms, construct new identities, liberate new desires, maybe new politics. Women's suffrage is a great example of that. So here's a movement that people have been working for a very long time. Here in New England, maybe some of you are familiar with the very famous letter writing that John and Abigail Adams were doing when he was in politics and in government service, and as they were crafting the Constitution, Abigail wrote very famously, "Remember the ladies, right? We're here too." And then the suffrage movement really takes off in the 1830s, 40s, the Seneca Falls Conference out in New York in 1848. But it's not until 1920 that the 19th Amendment was ratified. So this was something that women were working for a very, very, very long time. But it came to fruition in this moment when they finally were able to get the men to vote yes, was in this moment of change, right here at the end of World War I. And so you see some of the familiar images of the women who became known as suffragettes, which is kind of like the Rockettes, but with a very political ambition. And what I find so fascinating about this is, as I mentioned, this movement to get national voting, national right to vote for women, that this is a movement that had been building for decades and decades and decades and decades. And you can go back, and I've got some of the more recent photos here, but you can go back and look at Susan B. Anthony and Alice Paul and many of the suffragettes of the 19th century, of the Victorian age, and they all kind of look and dress like this. And what blows my mind is that as soon as they got the right to vote, some really interesting and unexpected things happened. The younger generation of women took this idea of equality and they transferred it from the political realm into the social realm. And I would love to go back and interview some of these ladies and see how surprised or maybe horrified they'd be at what the young women did. Completely different outlook on what gender equity would mean, not in the sense of a political right, but in a social and cultural expression of new ways of thinking about what did it mean to be an American woman. And you can see it quite clearly in the costuming. I'm a cultural historian, so I really like looking at things like fashion. And when I'm talking about this, especially with students, we'll point out and ask them to say, well, describe what you see in the suffragette's costume, right? Very, very, very long skirts. The sleeves tend to come all the way to the wrist. Gloves, very high-necked blouses and dresses. The hair's kept up under a big hat. So there's very little of the body that is seen. There's very little flesh that is seen in the costuming of the suffragettes. Not so much for the younger women of the 1920s who had different ideas about what clothes should be, or maybe shouldn't be. So Louise Brooks, Clara Bow, two really famous actresses of the 1920s. And it's fascinating to look at how quick, again, it's triggered by a political change, the right to vote, but it ends up with a very interesting cultural outcome. Here is Mary Pickford. She was one of the big starlets of the silent film era. And so when the movie industry was still based here on the East Coast, in and around New York and New Jersey, Mary Pickford was a really popular actress. And you can see some of the Victorian aspects of her dress in this publicity shot, but what I find fascinating is the still shot from the 1922 film Tess of Storm Country. And in it we see an expression of gender roles of a very dominant male figure, right, who is physically larger than the female figure. And you notice all the energy is going in this direction, right? He's putting it out and she is cowering away in a defensive, kind of defensive posture, right? And so this is a real expression of male dominance in the gender relation. We only have to fast forward a couple of years to a Clara Bow film called Man Trap. And again, Clara Bow appearing rather scantily clad, it's an understatement. And there's a still shot from the movie she did in 1926 called Man Trap. And in this one, we see a really different gender dynamic going on, where the woman is the center of the story, and she also seems to be very much in control of these men who are kind of befuddled and buffooned, and they're not really sure what to do. This guy's going with the wrong foot, right? She's leading the dance. He's attempting to follow. This guy's super confused, and So a really different way of thinking about the male-female relationship and what is being put out on the screen, what's coming out in the culture of mass media. And that's kind of important for us too, in thinking about city dwellers versus country people. If you go back to the 1930s is when we have, during the New Deal, the Rural Electrification Administration. This was one of Roosevelt's programs that gave loans to power companies to expand the grid into rural areas. They also did a lot of hydroelectric dam building, right? The Hoover Dam, Grand Coulee Dam, Tennessee Valley Authority. So it's in the 1930s, electricity started to get to the countryside. But in the 19-teens and 1920s, if you lived out in the country, you probably didn't have electricity. And that means you don't have a radio, don't have electric lights. A lot of the things that are really creating modernity, creating a modern experience for Americans, it's more isolated into the cities, and the country people were having a different experience, more traditional experience. So even the display of changes, such as what we see in these films, more likely to be seeing this if you lived in a city than if you lived in Bucksnort, Tennessee, which is an actual place. If you ever go to Central Tennessee, you can visit Bucksnort. So things were changing. We see a lot of this in the consumer culture. Now, I've included some of these ads that are more like domestically based, so like a lot of advertisements for foods, things that you and I find in Shaw's and Stop and Shop and so forth today. But I also included some of these advertisements from the 1920s that have something to do with different ideas about recreation, about gender, about independence. So the idea of being able to drive and kind of just go where you want to go. There's a lot that's tied into the freedom of the automobile. In fact, it was having wide-ranging implications, including how men and women related to each other. There's a really interesting book called, it's a history of the automobile, and it's called it involves the automobile. It's a history of dating in America, and the title of the book is From Front Porch to Back Seat, the history of dating in the United States. So that idea that you'd go, well, what they used to say, pitch and woo, right? You'd go out on the porch of the parents' house, where under the watchful eye, as opposed to, hey, jump in the car, let's go. And off in a cloud of dust to who knows where. Or these ideas of like women smoking, right, which had been traditionally a very male activity. But in the 1920s, we see lots of women taking this up. It's kind of a signature aspect of the Flapper Girls. And again, a more liberated body, if you will. Again, very different from the dress that we saw coming out of the Victorian age. So consumerism is changing things. Instead of people getting products from their local farm or growing their own food or making their own clothing, more and more Americans went shopping. More and more, the things that they surrounded themselves with were coming from factories someplace else and not being made by hand. That's a change too. This is an advertisement that I really, really like. It's for Wilson Haberdashery. And this you can see from Saturday Evening Post. This was in 1928. And I love this advertisement because it shows a lot of these different effects of gender roles and clothing. The automobile is prominently displayed. This is an advertisement for clothes. But if you just look at it like this, you might imagine it's an advertisement for the car. But in fact, it's an advertisement for the clothing. But it's showing this kind of, well, they wouldn't have used the word hip, but this sort of hip, new, relaxed life. You jump in the car with your friends, male and female, go someplace, be casual, play games. You know, it's so casual they even let the dog lick the plate. You know, that's how relaxed and happy these people are, playing their games. Maybe they're drinking beer. Hard to say what the bottle is, but they're, you know, having this relaxed attitude. Men and women in a very equal social station on display here. Other changes. of course, we're talking about a period that is after slavery, but during the segregation and Jim Crow period. But a lot of African Americans were not going to put up with segregation. They said, we're going to step out into American society in an event known as the Harlem Renaissance, which is actually the label that we can put on a lot of different artists and writers. Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston. Aaron Douglas is one of my favorites. He was a painter, did a lot of murals. And here you see one called Building More Stately Mansions. And so here's another sign of change. In this case, African Americans saying we don't want to be thought of or be hemmed into an inferior social position, which is what all of segregation was about. You've seen, of course, the white and colored drinking fountains, the different places on the bus and train. So rather than accept that second-class status, African American artists and writers and leaders tried to show the black experience as being central to the whole growth of society. In this painting, showing images that harken back to ancient Egypt, European or American Christian churches, and also the American skyscrapers and the American urban scene, and that black workers, black builders, black learners, black educators, black engineers were at the heart of all of these things. And so we have women living new and different lives, African Americans stretching out and trying to live new and different lives. Again, lots and lots of change. But when there is change, it's like Newton said, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. And so in times of great change, we also have great resistance to that change. And when progressivism becomes very strong, often too, so does conservatism. And the forces strive against each other. All of these changes we're talking about really were threatening older traditional rural ways of living. And the people in those parts of the country stood up and said, we don't want this change. We want tradition. And they found many ways of enacting that. Prohibition is one. Again, this is a movement that people had been striving for also going back to the 1800s. And there's many of these from the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And this was very much thought of as a Protestant Christian movement. This is not something that Catholic Americans tended to support. This was something that was particularly popular in rural states and regions, and particularly in Protestant communities. And so the Women's Christian Temperance Union and other opponents of alcohol succeeded in, with their support, getting the 18th Amendment, the Volstead Act, passed and then ratified in 1919. And so prohibition kicked in the next year and lasted until the Democrats came into power during the Great Depression. Roosevelt and the others who were elected in 1932. Now, what's interesting to me about this is that while a lot of the country was in favor of banning alcohol sales, I mean, you don't get a congressional amendment passed with minority support, right? Like the way they wrote the amendment of the Constitution, you have to have a lot of support to get something passed. Not only does Congress have to pass it, but 2/3 of the states have to approve. So the fact that this was passed tells us it was very, very popular. However, somebody was buying booze, because Al Capone, running the bootleg operation out of the Lincoln Hotel in Chicago, became one of the richest people in the country. That was his net worth at the time. If you factor that for inflation, it's like several $billion. So somebody was buying the booze, even though the nation politically as a whole had said we don't want it. Again, most of this is happening in the cities. Right? Most of these votes are coming from the more rural states, showing us again that difference. Another way that we see conservative values, and especially conservative religious values, on display was the banning of the teaching of evolution. Obviously, there's a lot of discussions that happen today about what can be taught, what should be taught, where can things be taught. Well, this was the question that was being debated back in the 1920s, and a lot of states passed evolution bans, so not to be taught in school. I suspect some of you have encountered this event before. Dayton, Tennessee is in very rural eastern Tennessee, in Appalachia. very, very small communities. And that's where John Scopes lived. That's John Scopes here, the taller fellow. And he was a school teacher, and he refused to follow the state law, and in fact insisted that he would teach his students Darwin's theory of evolution. That was against the law in Tennessee, and this became what was known at the time as the trial of the century. Real big celebrity lawyers. I mean, I think back to like, was it Johnny Cochran in the O.J. case? And how he became sort of a daily celebrity on television. There was a very famous defense attorney back then, Clarence Darrow, who came to Tennessee to defend John Scopes. I think Darrow was based out of Chicago, but he said, I'm going to go to Tennessee, to this small little town, and I'm going to defend this man's right to teach evolution to his students. That prompted William Jennings Bryan, who had been the Democratic presidential candidate in 1896, lost to McKinley. He came to Dayton to join the prosecution. So he represented that more rural Protestant Christian America. And so this garnered national attention. In the end, Scopes had broken the law. It's kind of like Rosa Parks. Yes, she broke the law. She sat in the white section of the bus. There's no doubt about that. But she did it as a protest, and so too this case. And that really shows us something about, again, this conflict of different values, science versus traditional religion, that were on display. I don't know who put that sign up, read your Bible, whether that was already there or whether that was placed because the trial was going on. That would be an interesting history mystery to investigate. And that brings us to the Ku Klux Klan, and the image that you saw in the beginning of the presentation. The Ku Klux Klan had originally emerged in Tennessee in a town called Pulaski. It's south of Nashville, down by the Alabama border, and it originally emerged in the years right after the Civil War. These were many ex-Confederates who did not want to see the end of slavery. They did not want to see equal rights in the 14th Amendment. They did not want to see voting rights for black men in the 15th Amendment, and they fought against the occupation of the Union Army and other Northerners who came down to the South in the wake of the Confederate defeat. The Klan was fought vociferously and strongly physically by the U.S. government. When Ulysses S. Grant was president, they passed what was known as the Klan Act, which many people regard as the first anti-terrorism law in American history. It gave the government special powers to prosecute Klan members in the South, and they did a fairly effective job of stamping out the Ku Klux Klan in the times of Reconstruction. But in the 1920s and the 19-teens, the Klan came back, much bigger than ever before and very different than what it was before in its first iteration. When the Klan first came up in the South in the years after the Civil War, it was exclusively for men. It was a secret organization, that's why the masks, and it was essentially there to terrorize people, to terrorize blacks not to vote, not to assert their economic rights, and so forth. The Klan of the 1920s is very different, and you can probably notice from the map there's a lot of places where there was a governor elected with Klan support. That's your blue dots. Oh look, Maine even. That's a question for us to try to answer. Places with the green triangle, U.S. Senator elected with Klan support. That's even Oregon, Colorado. We're far, far, far from the South when we're looking at those states. Or major areas of Klan violence, including here in the Northeast and in addition to the South. So what's going on? The Klan in the 1920s was a national movement. It was not restricted to the South. And when you look at the photograph over here, we see some interesting things. This is not a secret organization anymore, right? These people are proudly marching down Pennsylvania Avenue with the American flag, no masks, and you'll also see lots of women. And this is something that I'm often pointing out to dispel. I hear a lot from students this kind of mythological statement where they'll say, oh yeah, you know, all those women, they fought for voting rights because they believed in equality. And I say, yeah, well, a bunch of them got the right to vote and joined the Klan. So when we talk about equality, we have to put an asterisk on that. They believed in equality for some people, but evidently not for everybody. And when we ask, why is the Klan so popular not only in the South, but in places like California, Oregon, and especially here in Maine, what is that about? Well, this ties us into a lot of ideas of scientific racism. It's sometimes called social Darwinism. And basically what we have to come to terms with is, you know, Hitler and the Nazis weren't the only people thinking about racial supremacy and ideas about racial purity. This was a movement that was alive and well in the United States in the 19-teens and 1920s. Madison Grant wrote this book. I've broken one of the rules of PowerPoint and I've put a whole bunch of text up there. But we can pull out some of the real key ideas. The idea of interracial marriage as racial suicide and disappearance of white civilization. Talking about mixing of higher racial types with lower racial types, and that the so-called lower type always would, quote unquote, win in a case of interracial progeny. So he writes, the cross between a white man and an Indian is an Indian, the cross between a white man and a Negro is a Negro, etc., etc. Using words like unimpaired purity. Again, just to emphasize, it's not just the Nazis who are talking about ideas of racial purity. This is something that was really popular here in the United States. There's a lot of this material I could show. It was prevalent, but this example should at least cover the case about how there were many people of the old stock, meaning people who descended from immigrants in the colonial times, people from Britain, people from Germany, from the Netherlands, basically North and West European Americans who were very concerned about race mixing that would happen at this time. There were, and again, I want to emphasize, this isn't something that's coming from like people who are without education or people who are living in isolation. These are ideas that are coming out from some of the educational leaders of the country, some of the intellectuals of the country. E.B. Cubberley was an education professor at Stanford, pretty highly regarded university out west. And he wasn't just talking about Native Americans and Black Americans. He had questions, significant doubts about even European immigrants who were coming from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe. So the very people who you see in Fiddler on the Roof, right, coming from East Europe, Ukraine, Russia. This, of course, is also the period of the massive Italian immigration. We do a study, I don't know much about here in Foxborough, but I have my students at Dean over in Franklin. We do a study of the town war memorials. And they catalog all the family names of the war memorials from the American Revolution up through World War II. And then they put these all into a database and they start researching the nationalities and ethnicities of the family names, of the surnames. And what they can easily see is a huge influx of Irish and Italian, especially Italian people into the town of Franklin back around the time of World War I, right, when this was happening. And those immigrants were facing enormous backlash from the, again, the old stock that considered themselves of Anglo-Saxon, so like English Germanic, like British Germanic. But again, that's North and West Europe, not South and East. And so, again, this isn't something that's being said by, you know, someone in the backwoods. This is somebody who is educating, right, the next generation of teachers and scholars, and again, at a pretty prestigious university. But they were reacting to massive immigration that was happening. It was alarming to them that not only was there a different type of person coming here, Catholic, Jewish, Italian, French-Canadian, Hungarian, Russian. It's not just the type, it's also the sheer volume. Almost 1 million immigrants per year arriving in the United States. And it hit a peak right at the beginning of our decade that we're talking about. Almost 1 million new people arriving in just that, what is that, 12, 13-month period from June of 20 to June of 21. And they reacted. They passed another immigration law. There's lots and lots and lots of immigration laws that get passed. Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1880s was probably the most restrictive of all of them, where they said no one from China can immigrate here. And that was a reaction to the years after the gold rush. A lot of Irish Americans in California didn't want Chinese immigrants to come to California. So there's a lot of different immigration laws. This is a big one that got passed in 1924. And what it does is it goes back to the 1890 census. So it's retreating 30 years into the past. It's a very, 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 very conservative law. And they say you can bring in 2% of whichever group based on their percentage in society in 1890. And I actually brought the law with me, or a copy of it. And I'm happy to pass this around or show it later. It shows that they're really giving preferential treatment to people from specific countries. So based on this quota system, for example, they're getting people from countries that people had been here for a long time. So in 1924, from Germany, they would allow 51,227 immigrants from Germany. From Great Britain, 34,000. But Italy, only 3,800. So less than 10%. So what they're saying is if you're from Italy, don't come. If you're from Britain or Germany, you're welcome. Some of the other ones that are really interesting, maybe another one that would be good would be like what do they say about the Russian Empire? Yeah, the whole Russian Empire, only 2,000 were allowed in. So, but 9,000 from Sweden. 6,400 from Norway. So really, really saying, if you're from North Europe, West Europe, please come. Otherwise, not so much. This is also, again, to draw a relation to things that we experience today, this is also the time that this was the law that created the U.S. Border Patrol, which we obviously have today. And here's a photo, as you can see, from Texas, where uniformed officers as well as civilians, armed civilians, were guarding the southern border in 1926. Open a newspaper today and you read something about that too. And some of this became violent. There's many, many examples we could give. The Sacco and Vanzetti case, I think a lot of you probably know about. It's such a big case here in New England, in Massachusetts. This had to do with a murder in Braintree at a shoe factory. And the case was tried at the Dedham Superior Court. And so people go to that courthouse and for sort of historical tourism. Sacco and Vanzetti, I'm not a legal historian, so I haven't reviewed the case and all the evidence and documents. But generally speaking, most legal historians believe in reviewing the case that the proof that Sacco and Vanzetti committed the murder, well, it was not proven. But they were convicted and they were in 1921, and they were executed here in Massachusetts in 1927. And most of the historians who specialize in this subject come to the conclusion that their execution had more to do with them being Italian anarchists than it did with the actual guilt in the case. And anarchism was running wild here in Massachusetts, thanks to some great local historians. Alan Earls, who's on our historical commission in Franklin, unearthed the story just down the street from Dean College. We had a lot of mill buildings in Franklin. There was woolen and textile production, straw hats, a lot of mills dotted around Franklin. So there was a group of 4 Italian anarchists. There was a leader named Galliani who had been promoting anarchism among Italian immigrants. They constructed a bomb, and they were intending to blow up the Ray woolen mill. Ray is very near and dear to us at Dean because other than our founder, Oliver Dean, the Ray family were the most important people in building and supporting and sustaining Dean back in its early decades. And they were bringing the bomb to the factory, and it exploded and blew them all to bits. But you can go to Sugar Beet Road right off Union Street in Franklin and see where this happened in 1919. So that is the context in which these things were happening. There was also the Red Scare, the anti-communist, anti-socialist craze in 1919. There were race riots in East St. Louis and in Chicago, in New York, the Palmer raids where the government was targeting people who were suspected communists. So if you're familiar with McCarthyism, this is kind of like McCarthyism round one that happened, and this is the context in which this was taking place. So the 1920s, you know, we often think of the Flabber Girls as we should. That's a really important part of this decade in our past, but there's many, many other elements that are going on. And we can go back to that theory that when the economy booms, which it was, then you have lots of new other things attached to that. And when you have new and other things, it can also bring out forces of traditionalism and conservatism. And in the 1920s, they battled, and in some cases, really violently battled. And so, you know, we talk a lot today about America being divided. We talk a lot today about having culture wars. And as a historian, I don't believe that history repeats itself, but I definitely think that it rhymes. It's kind of a lot of the same patterns that we see. It's always different and unique in its own moment, but there are many things that we can say are kind of similar. So I hope that you found some things that were touchstones that you were familiar with that you could connect to, but also hopefully some new information or interesting different things to think about too. So that rounds out what my prepared remarks, but I'd be very happy if you want to discuss any of this or questions or anything like that.
Yeah, there's one thing this brings to my mind. It's, I was born and raised in England, and earliest memories of when I was very young, early 50s, and I was looking at the status of women, and I can remember when the first people, my father included, got one of the first cars in this village, and then, horror of horrors, some woman learned to drive, and she was driving. And I remember the adult men, they were really threatened by this. Now I look back, they were threatened because it was a male world. And there were always jokes about women drivers. They were always putting them down. And, you know, and now I look back, it was, they were just insecure, you know. Their world was
changed.
Punctured. They
Yes.
didn't like it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a great story, Jim. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, I think that that's sort of the rhyming part of it, in that when change happens, you know, there's always those who embrace the change because there's some opportunity for them. But that might be a challenge to the folks who are more in the status quo. And I think that I try to, you know, and even today, I try to, and especially as a historian, to understand why people were doing what they were doing. I don't personally agree with some of the violence. I don't personally agree with some of the discriminatory laws. However, I think when we look at how rapidly that world was changing, and especially for the folks coming from a rural background where things tend to not change very quickly, this was very threatening, very challenging. And to see the country changing so quickly made many of them angry and violent. And you see it more peacefully in the laws, but it does spill over too. Yeah, yeah, thanks. Yeah.
The young ladies are the movie stars, and you see the old movies, they were swinging their beads, they had the short skirt and the band. If that was during Prohibition, was it during Prohibition? Where were they having these dances and everything?
Yeah.
In speakeasies?
Yes. If you read
they
the...
were out in the public then.
Yeah, they were, this was publicly accepted, especially in cities. I don't think you'd be getting away with this in the smaller towns, but in Chicago and in New York and Philadelphia and Boston, there was a market for people who wanted the booze and they wanted the nightlife. The interesting thing about the law, if you go back and look at it, I'll read how it's written. This is the 18th Amendment, and there's some legal stuff about 1 year from ratification, blah, blah, blah. the manufacture, sale, and transportation, so I'll re-emphasize those verbs. The manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors within, or the importation thereof into, or the exportation thereof from the United States and all territories subject to jurisdiction is hereby prohibited. So to shorten that, the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors is hereby prohibited. It doesn't say to consume them. There's nothing about consuming intoxicated liquors in the law. So the people who are on the hook are your, where's my Al Capone picture? I actually have a really great, I thought about putting it in here. We have a photograph, Gabby Hartnett was a Dean graduate and became a really successful baseball player. He was a catcher for the Chicago Cubs. He won the National League MVP in 1935, and he's from Millville or Blackstone, just a little west. Anyway, we have a really fun photograph of him talking to Al Capone in the stands at Wrigley Field. And I should have put that photo in there because it's a neat connection to Dean. It's our little Al Capone connection. But the people on the hook were people like him. That's why he made all the money. It's the people who are importing it, the bootleggers. It's the people who are creating, you know, the moonshiners and the bathtub gin people. And it's the people who are selling it at the speakeasies who are the ones who are breaking the law. But the patrons who go to drink it aren't technically breaking the law. So they could have local ordinances, that's true. And especially in the rural counties, this is just kind of showing my own bias. When I moved to the South, I mostly lived in I lived in Baton Rouge, I lived in Nashville, I lived in Memphis. But when I'd go to do research on my blues project, and I was out in small counties and communities in Tennessee and Mississippi, and I'd get there and be like, oh, that was a hard day's of work. It's Miller time. And I'm like, where's the damn beer? And you couldn't buy it anywhere. So Arkansas. So a lot of places that were dry, even as, you know, into the 1990s, I don't know about now, but the thing is, yeah, it was not illegal for those people to go drink it. It was the ones making it. So it was this interesting market that existed. So even though there were so many people who were saying we don't want booze around, there were a lot of people who did. But again, mostly in the cities.
Demise in 1933. What transpired? You said the Democrats came in.
Yeah, that's a big change. So you can look back. There were 18. I hope I'm not screwing this up. But they always say don't do live math on TV. There were like 18 presidential elections between Lincoln in 1860 and Roosevelt in 1932. Of those 18, 14 were won by Republicans. And only 4 of those elections were run by Democrats, and they were actually run by the same one, Harrison twice and then Woodrow Wilson twice. So this was a long period of Republican control of national government, and the people who tended to be white Anglo-Saxon Protestant tended to vote Republican unless they were in the Deep South, in which case they voted Democratic based on going back to Lincoln and the Civil War. And that lasted until the 1970s and 80s even. All of that to say, when Roosevelt and the Democrats won big in 32, because the Depression was so horrible. If you look at an electoral map of 1928, it's a sea of red. Hoover was hugely popular. And then you have the stock market crash and the Great Depression, and in 1932 it's all blue, except for Massachusetts, actually. Was that the one that Massachusetts? No, that was in 1928. They voted Al Smith because he was the anti-prohibition candidate. The Democrats in the cities where there had been lots of immigrants, and especially Catholic immigrants, were against prohibition. And so when Roosevelt won, they got rid of it, partly for that reason, but also because they wanted the tax revenue again. And it's the same kind of thing we talk about with like recreational cannabis in states today, right? The politicians maybe aren't that interested in the actual substance, but they want the tax revenue. And during the Depression, that was a big part of the decision.
Do your woman got the vote, the Volstead Act. Who was in charge of the temperance movement? Who was the one that pushed it? Females.
That's right. That's right. And that goes very much with this. And when we look at the origins of it, it is definitely women who are facing physical abuse at the hands of their drunk husbands. And there's some fascinating and tragic studies about the rates of alcoholism and the domestic violence in the 1800s, and especially against women, and that was, yeah, a big part of it. So, yeah, it's interesting to look at the different aspects of why these laws are getting passed and who's voting for them. Yeah, good point. Yeah, good stuff. Other things folks wanted to follow up on?
Your map of the Ku Klux Klan and the governors
Yeah.
who were supported by them. The major areas of Klan violence, we've got one, and that looks like it's in Massachusetts.
Right.
Is that, do you happen to know anything about that?
Looks like Springfield or Worcester to me.
It is. The way where they've put it, it is. It's more like Springfield. So I don't know really exactly what that's referring to. I don't believe I don't know, I've not seen evidence that the Klan was involved in things like Sacco and Vansetti. So I don't know exactly what, that's a good history mystery for us to find out about. The Klan of the 20s is really quite fascinating because they use a lot of the language that has been used before and since to differentiate what they would think of as like real Americans versus non-real Americans. And Hiram Wesley Evans was a dentist from Texas who was the leader of the Klan in the 1920s. And he put out a publication, and I can read some of it to you, where he says that, you know, we are a movement of plain people. And we're weak in the matter of culture, intellectual support, and trained leadership. We are the average citizen of the old stock. And he says, to understand the Klan is necessary to understand the character and present mind of the mass of old stock Americans. The mass, it must be remembered, as distinguished from the intellectually mongrelized liberals, he puts in quotes. He says there's a moral breakdown that's been going on for 2 decades. All of our traditional and moral standards went by the boards or were so disregarded that they ceased to be binding. The sacredness of our Sabbath, of our homes, of chastity, finally even our right to teach our own children in our own schools, fundamental facts and truths were torn away from us. Then he goes on and talks about longstanding distrust of the Roman Catholic Church, which is the chief leader of alienism, the most dangerous alien power with a foothold in our boundaries. He says these are the instincts of loyalty to the white race, to the traditions of America, to the spirit of Protestantism, which has been an essential part of Americanism ever since the days of Roanoke and Plymouth Rock. They are condensed into the Klan slogan, Native White Protestant Supremacy. So that's where you can really see. He doesn't actually say anything in there about black Americans or that more kind of traditional racism dating back to slavery. This is really about immigration and people who live in cities and people who are intellectual, and it's the same language that Joe McCarthy used in the Red Scare in the 1950s. He talked about intellectuals on the East Coast and that they're poisoning America, and so it's fascinating to see this like recurrence of some of these similar themes, and it's like a bit of a toolkit that could be picked up. But you know, we talked today about red states and blue states, but really if you look at electoral returns, there's hardly any states that are fully red or fully blue. You can look at an electoral map of even our most recent elections, and you could look at a state that's super red, like let's say, for example, like Nebraska. Very, very red state. But you can see where the University of Nebraska is that county's blue. Same thing in Texas, very, very red state. But you can see San Antonio, Austin, Dallas, Houston, El Paso. You can see where the urban areas are because they're voting. And it's similar here. People in the middle of the country think New York is like all Democratic and liberal, but it's not. If you look at the state map of New York, once you get out of New York City and get up into upstate, there's a lot of red counties. You can point out where Syracuse is, and you can point out where Albany is and Buffalo, but other than that, most of New York is red. So the thing that's crazy about that is when we go back to the first national election that this country had, ratifying the Constitution, you see the same thing. The people who live on the coast voted for the Constitution. The people who lived in the interior voted against it. Rural versus urban is, to me, the clearest voting pattern we can see. It's what seems to be determining what party people vote for, more so than any other factors, and it's been historically consistent. So you can have some fun on the internet search machine and look at electoral maps from any different election and look at the county by county results, and you'll see the same thing again and again and again and again and again.
Is the question about the Klan being active in Massachusetts or the violence by the Klan?
This would be the specific violence, and I don't know what that is.
Because I have a personal story,
Mm-hmm.
and it didn't have anything to do with the Klan violence, but it was amazing to me. I was visiting with my father's first cousin, who he had nothing to do with, but doing my genealogy, I ran into him. Larry was his name. And Larry invited me to go with him to his daughter's house. And in the conversation, he started to tell about, in the 20s, he and his brother rode on the running board of a Klan operator in the city of Brockton.
Wow.
And he said they went up to Brockton Heights. Now, I lived in Brockton Heights. And they put the cross up and they burned it. And his daughter was flabbergasted that he would come up with that story.
I'm sure.
And I said to her, do you want me to go home now? But she didn't know that part of the story. And he came out and told her like I was there. Now, he said afterwards he didn't stay with it. But he and his brother rode in that car, and the driver came up from Louisiana.
Okay.
It was
Interesting. Very interesting.
Well, that's only one little snippet. I don't know.
Yeah,
before and
right.
after, but
Right.
it's a true story. So it was popular in Brockton, Mass.
Interesting.
Question about Maine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that is a response to, as I mentioned before, all the French Catholic immigrants into New England would have been, and again, when you read that testimony or that document from the Klan leader and this strong suspicion of Catholics, and even thinking that, you know, until Biden, John Kennedy is still the only Catholic president who's been elected. Everybody else has professed Protestantism until Biden is the second Catholic president. So this, you know, and you know, I highlighted some things with the Italian immigrants here, but certainly we can talk about, you know, the No Irish Need Apply and a lot of those feelings that have to do with religion and really are imported. A lot of those ideas imported from the British Isles and long-standing conflict between the English and the Irish and the colonization of Ireland, and of course we all know about the, you know, the Troubles and, you know, Northern Ireland as well historically. So that religious difference, which I bring up with especially with the younger people, because religious difference doesn't seem to be the thing that's on everybody's minds so much now. And religious toleration has been pretty, pervasive. But when we go back to this time period, the religious differences seem to be right up there with the ethnic and linguistic and racial differences that we probably were more easily to guess.
I found it interesting about Laredo, Texas, and then the other side is
yeah.
Laredo.
Yeah.
Were there immigrants coming in there? Because that's where I crossed into Mexico. It's still a crossing point.
Yeah.
What prompted this?
Yeah, so there was some immigration from Latin America into the United States. It was very small compared to from Eastern and Southern Europe, but there were a lot of employers in Texas and Arizona who liked the extremely cheap labor of Mexicans and who could cross the border and work for very little and then go back. And there's a lot of history about that cross-border migration that was happening. So there was uncontrolled immigration that this was meant to stop in the 1920s, and there was, and I forget all the details, but there was the Pancho Villa. This was something that's like 1918, 1917, 18, right? And so that concern that people could cross the border and escape justice or elude the authorities. So there are some dynamics that were happening, and then this also would become important with prohibition because they're trying to stop people from importing alcohol as well.
What's so funny is, in the early 1960s, we went to live for 3 months down next to Guadalajara in Chapala. And I said to my parents, the men had their pants rolled up, and they were running across Rio Grande, which in places is only this
yeah.
high. I said, what are the people all running into the United States? She says, don't pay any attention to that.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, so, you know, I don't know, nobody was doing anything to them. They were running from Mexico into, I
Yeah,
don't know if they were day laborers. I had no
Right.
idea. I was only a teenager.
yeah. In my world, in doing cultural history, there's a lot of, I'm very interested in music and popular and folk music. There are a lot of songs that were, they called them the norteños or the northerners, and these songs about people who had left Mexico to come live here in the United States and sometimes going back and forth. And they wrote these songs and performed these songs that were talking about that experience, either people lamenting that their loved ones had gone to the north, or the songs of the ones who had been making the migration and what they were experiencing. So.
Well, I know at this particular time, when we came back into the United States, we had bought a half dozen oranges. They weren't interested in anything but those oranges. Probably because they might bring back something.
Disease
for
or
the crops.
something,
No,
yes, yeah.
They actually took the seats out of our car.
Yeah, yeah.
Because we said we bought 6 and we only could account we couldn't account for all 6.
Wow, you might have eaten one.
Well, we ate them, but we couldn't, we weren't, I guess, understanding about everything. You know, we said, well, how many oranges did you eat? How many oranges?
Oh my goodness.
You know, and there was like 1 or 2 missing or something crazy. And I didn't even know seats came out of it.
Right.
There they were
But
on,
they
on the
did.
pavement,
Yeah.
looking for the orange.
Yeah, when I lived in Louisiana, I used to go to Mexico quite a bit. Actually, places I wouldn't go now because of the cartel violence, and it's just absolutely dangerous. But it used to strike me so much how, you know, coming into the United States, you know, experiences like that, lots of questions, banging on the doors, tearing the cars apart. But then to go into Mexico, you would just have to like throw some money in the basket. And I remember one time I got stuck. I was traveling with a friend of mine who was from Finland, and he didn't have a visa, but evidently was supposed to have a visa. And they took him in and interrogated him, and I was standing out front and just hanging out by the car. And the officials came and they said, well, do you have papers? And I was like, papers? I said, no, I don't have any papers. They said, you don't have any papers, any passport papers, anything like that? I was like, no, I have a driver's license. And he said, you don't have any papers? I said, no. And he's like, all right. I'm going to go interrogate the Finnish guy some more. I mean, and you know, so that is interesting to think about the history. I mean, obviously it's all over in the news, and there's a lot of things that are happening on the southern border. But it is interesting to go back and look at that history over time and see how this has evolved and ebbed and flowed.
When we were going going into Mexico, the only thing they said to us, you have to come back in this car. In other words, we couldn't go to Mexico, sell the car, and then fly back. They were very, very definite about that.
Interesting. Huh. Do you have any idea why? I haven't heard anything like that before. Huh.
Not a clue.
Interesting. And that was in the 60s, you said?
Early
Yeah.
60s.
Huh. Yeah, yeah, Jim.
Just talking about the Klan, it's not so long ago. I was in the U.S. military in the 60s, and our sergeant overseas, he was master sergeant, and one day I went in a shack, you know, and he was crying. And I said, gee, Sarge, I said, what's going on? He said, those SOBs, he said, he was from somewhere, I don't know, Southern Europe, I don't know. He said, they burned a cross on my mother's lawn, and he said, they scared her half to death.
Wow.
And he said, I'm over here in the service, and they're burning a cross on our lawn. And this was, you know, 66,
Yeah.
65. I mean, it's not ancient history.
Right. And there was a lot of violence in the civil rights era. I mean, everybody remembers the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, but there was a lot of violence. There are, you know, other people like Medgar Evers, who was the head of the NAACP in Mississippi, who was murdered in his front lawn on his driveway. But there are a lot of stories of, well, there was the Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney. If you saw the film Mississippi Burning with Gene Hackman, there was a lot of violence, and there was a lot of violence in Reconstruction as well that people don't always talk about. There were massive race riots. There were lots of black communities that were burned to the ground. People run out of town. That stuff doesn't always get talked about. It doesn't always find its way into the popular history. And, you know, that's really, for me as a historian, I feel like part of our job in this industry is to just tell the history and not worry about, you know, are we feeding into some particular kind of narrative or not. I don't work in public schools either, so I, you know, don't know what that's like. There's so many other different pressures that happen. You know, as a professional historian, you know, based at a college, we just follow the evidence where it goes, right? So yeah, a lot of those types of stories, people were experiencing violence. And it does, it kind of brings us back to, you know, now I really want to find out. I'll come back and report back to you guys. If I can, like, what is that? Like, what was that? I really want to figure that out now, because I really don't know. Maybe it was Brockton. Maybe it was Brockton. Right, yeah.
So that's your homework lesson.
That's my homework, yes. I'll be back in touch.
Well, those stars may not, and symbols may not be accurately placed.
Right, yeah. I think some of them, they just kind of put them in the center.
Yeah,
So,
that may not be.
but it's definitely here in southern New England. So yeah, I'll see what I can find out about that and report back. The center of the Klan activity, and you can tell if you look, perhaps, is really it's really the lower Great Lakes region. It's really in this Midwest region, Indiana particularly. In fact, they used to do a thing where they would vote for like the most American town, and was it Muncie or Marion, Indiana, used to win that a lot. And so my father is from, well, he's passed away quite a while, but he was from southwestern Michigan, and his anecdotes were quite rife with different racist attitudes or other things that he had seen as a young person. And he said to me at one point, he said, yeah, there was a lot of Klan around. And my dad was born in the 30s, so he was reflecting back to around World War II era, which actually the war tamped down a lot of the racism in society, because Roosevelt and the New Dealers, when they had implemented a lot of programs in the New Deal that were pretty racially discriminatory early on. But as you get closer to the war and the desire to unify the country, they started making efforts to reduce discrimination. And for the fighting force, they really needed to, because in the battle against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, if you're going to tell a large part of the population, like, we don't need you, I mean, this was an all-hands-on-deck situation in the war. So they did make a lot of efforts to try to reduce the discrimination in order to build a unified fighting force. The military was not desegregated until, what, 46? After the war, but there were a lot of desegregation moments during the war. There was a naval destroyer, the Mason, that had an all-black crew. I think a lot of people know about the Flying Tigers, the Tuskegee Airmen. That's a pretty well-known story. There were other attempts at integrating during the war. So it is interesting. It's like, yeah, ebb and flow. Anybody want to talk about the cars anymore, though? I love the cars.
Yeah, when, well, I forgot his name, Pancho Villa, right?
Oh, yeah.
When he came over in New Mexico, he literally attacked a town that had a small garrison, I think, of the army. But anyway, so they built up and then they went down into Mexico to get him. From what I understand, that was the first time that automobiles were used in battle.
Ah.
And also,
For an operation, wow.
I can't think of the guy that was famous for tanks in World War II.
Colonel George Pershing.
Pershing?
No.
The German?
No.
The American?
We had 6 shooters.
Oh, you talked
Patton?
about,
Patton?
Okay, Patton. He put a machine gun on a car during that, I don't know.
Skirmish.
Yeah. So he was real young at the time, and so they think that was the first time it was put on a car. Interesting.
Yeah, there were episodes in the 20s or 30s where there was the mining, in some of the mining community, there was really, where was that one? Where they had this armored vehicle with a gun on it, and they went into the worker camp and they fired on everybody because the miners were striking against the company, and that's another very early instance of like a militarized automobile. But yeah, and then World War I, they had a little bit with tanks, but then definitely, yeah, by World War II, some of the technologies that were so important in World War II, like the tanks and the airplane, that were starting to be used in World War I, but then really came to fruition but yeah, back here in the 19-teens, you start seeing that. So I guess if you have a car, it's only a matter of time to put a gun on it. But
Henry Ford didn't put any on his Model Ts.
No, but we did have, where did Al Capone go? Because you did have, them driving around Chicago, shooting people up with Tommy guns, and none of them in the vault, though. I don't know if any of you watched that special with Geraldo Rivera back in whatever year that was, and all the build-up, and for weeks and weeks they said, we're going to go into Al Capone's vault, and there's Geraldo down in the basement of the Lincoln Hotel, and there wasn't nothing in there. Dirt and some bottles. They thought they were going to find millions. They don't know. That was funny. That was a big TV event, I remember very well.
Oak Island.
Oh, Oak Island just keeps going. My brother-in-law is fascinated with that show, and I hate to tell him, I'm like, hey, when I was a little kid, people were talking about this, and they still haven't found anything. You keep watching that show, though. You just keep watching. They're making money on it, absolutely.
Keep it going.
Yep. Yeah, I'm like, you keep watching. But I remember in the late 70s, we were talking about Oak Island, and that's been a while.
I found a couple of nails.
Right, some boards.
Staples.
Yep. Yes. Well, thank you all so very much for being a great audience. I really enjoyed doing this, and great questions, too.